One of my prisoners of conscience that I have adopted to bring more awareness to this issue in Nigeria is Leah Sharibu, who was a 15-year-old girl when she was abducted, remains being held by Boko Haram. She was taken, you might remember that story, there was about 105 girls from a girls' school that were taken. Some escaped initially, a few were killed, and later about 100 or so about 100 were released. She is the only one to remain being held by Boko Haram, and the reason, and they've made this very clear, is because she would not renounce her Christian faith.
Religious freedom is a universal human right, yet in many countries around the globe, people can't practice their faith freely. Could it be that this is increasingly happening in India, the world's largest democracy? Why are the Chinese regime's surveillance technologies not just a threat to religious minorities in China, but also free people globally? And among countries known for their egregious violations of religious freedom, how has Sudan recently made a turn for the better? In this episode, we sit down with Tony Perkins, chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, and president of the Family Research Council. He also hosts the nationally syndicated radio show, Washington Watch. We discuss USCIRF's new 2020 annual report. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Tony Perkins, chair of USCIRF, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Well, it's a very important time of year for you and your organization, the organization that you chair. You're dropping your report, annual report on the state of freedom of religion in the world right now. I've been looking over it. There's some pretty interesting new things that I frankly didn't expect, and I'm going to get you to tell me a little bit about this. But to start off, and of course a lot of things that we did expect, but still require being highlighted. Why don't you tell me overall, based on what you've found this year, what is the state of religious freedom in the world?
Well, as we talk about this from the standpoint of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I think it's helpful for people to understand where this is coming from, what this body is. It's a 9-member bipartisan commission, and so it's a very diverse group when it comes to politics, when it comes to religion, when it comes to ethnic backgrounds. And we have one mission, and one mission alone, and that is to look at the state of religious freedom around the globe. And quite frankly, it's been a real honor to serve with the other members of the commission because we've stayed focused on that. Even though we disagree on a number of other issues, on this issue, we are singularly focused. And our mission is to report to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to Congress what we find. And we, this year, have recommended that 14 countries be recognized as countries of particular concern. Those are countries that have this egregious, ongoing, systematic abuse of religious freedom. Either they're engaged in it or they're tolerating it, meaning they're allowing others to do it. And then we've got 15 countries that we've put on what is a new category for us, new category for the Department of State, and that is a special watch list. We used to have a tier 2 list. Now we've dropped that and gone with the special watch list, which means there's 2 of those 3 categories: systematic, ongoing, and egregious. 2 of those 3. Now, to the big picture, I think that one of the issues we're seeing is a greater awareness of religious freedom. And so with our awareness comes this understanding there's a problem. But there's some good news. And I'll point to one in particular, and that is the country of Sudan. After 3 decades of the Islamic regime of al-Bashir, he was deposed by his own country. We have now a transitional government led by Prime Minister Hamdok, who I was with him in February, went to Sudan with a delegation, met with him. They're making surprising movement toward respecting religious freedom, and it's very refreshing. One of the first things they did away with was a public order law, which was used to basically enforce an Islamic view on certain issues to repress the population, primarily women. That's been done away with. Shortly after we left in March, they did away with what's called these church laws. They were setting up these civil church structures to circumvent the actual churches themselves so they could take away their property. That's now been done away with. So we're seeing some very amazing and encouraging signs there in Sudan.
No, that's incredible. Actually, that's, I think kind of the cover of your report actually, features
Yes.
some of these images from Sudan. I want to kind of dig into that a little bit. Maybe, give you, I know you've been there. Maybe you can offer a few anecdotes from there in a moment. So, you have some of the usual suspects in the kind of, the egregious category, your top category. There's China, there's North Korea, Saudi Arabia is there. But, and I actually want to go into some of these further, but you've actually added a few, and notably India.
We've been seeing trends in India. They've been on what was our tier 2 list because of problems, and they're trending in a very problematic and troubling way. We're seeing, again, we're seeing this systematic, ongoing, and egregious violation of religious freedom, both by the state and by non-state entities that they're allowing it to happen. We've seen the citizenship, essentially registration law that was put into place at the end of last year, which is depriving a number of people who, for all intents and purposes, are citizens of India, but they're Muslim. They're coming in from other countries. They have to, or they've been in other countries. They have to prove their citizenship with certain, really, it's almost impossible to do. And it's only being applied to certain segments of the population, and disproportionately they're Muslim. And so we see a number of trends there that are problematic, and it's becoming increasingly dangerous in India for religious minorities.
One of the big topics, of course, that you've looked at in the past, I think Boko Haram is identified as a specific group that you look at for obvious reasons. And maybe you can actually speak to that a little bit, maybe not obvious to everybody, but also, Nigeria as a whole, as a country.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, Nigeria is a very problematic country when we see the trends there in Nigeria, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, Nigeria, most populous country on the African continent, 210 million people, pretty much evenly divided between Muslim and Christian, and we're again seeing this behavior that is systematic, ongoing, and egregious, where we see certain populations being targeted, where you're reading it all the time, you're seeing the videos of it. Boko Haram in some cases, Fulani herdsmen in other cases that are attacking churches, taking hostages, and the government is not doing anything about it to protect its own population. Now, about 2 years ago, President Buhari met with President Trump, and President Trump challenged him, said, you need to protect your population, you need to protect the Christians who are being attacked. And for about 6 months, he deployed troops to some of the more problematic areas, and we saw a decrease. But that has since gone by the wayside, and once again, we're seeing these attacks on villages and churches. We're seeing hostages taken, ransom demanded, and it's very problematic. In fact, one of my prisoners of conscience that I have adopted to bring more awareness to this issue in Nigeria is Leah Sheribu, who was a 15-year-old girl when she was abducted, remains being held by Boko Haram. She was taken, you might remember that story, there was about 105 girls from a girls' school that were taken. Some escaped initially, a few were killed, and later about 100 or so were released. She is the only one to remain being held by Boko Haram, and the reason, and they've made this very clear, is because she would not renounce her Christian faith. And so again, we see this type of behavior, and not necessarily at the hands of the government, but the government is not doing anything to keep it in check.
I see. And so what does it mean exactly that you've adopted someone? So presumably all the commissioners on USCIRF will do this. And what's the idea there?
It's a program we have because, when you start dealing with numbers, I mean, I could go through all kinds of numbers here if you wanted to, but, people's eyes would quickly begin to glaze over, because numbers mean nothing. But when you start talking about people, talk about names, and you talk about stories, and that these are real people. These are people who have families. Leah's father, I can relate to him. He's a police officer. I used to be a police officer, and he was out away doing his job when the school in which his daughter was in was attacked. And I can only imagine the helplessness that her father has felt. I've met with her mother now a few times. And they're just obviously distraught, heartbroken over this. And that story is repeated many times over. But by at least us taking one story, a story that we can, become a part of, and we can get to know the family, and we can begin to advocate for them, we bring greater awareness to the whole issue. And that's the purpose. It's not just to highlight one case of a 15-year-old girl in Nigeria, but rather to bring awareness to the overall threat that people are facing around the globe because of their religious beliefs.
Well, there's one very high-profile case that you were involved in not too long ago, Pastor Brunson, of course. And so what is the situation in Turkey since? Has something changed because of this intervention, because of this work?
Well, I wish I could say that Turkey has become a better place, but I don't think that is the case. We continue to have or recommend that they be on a special watch list, and we're watching them very closely because there still seems to be this, as again, two of the three we see is this ongoing behavior by the state, and it's somewhat systematic because they are interfering with churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Church, refusing to allow them to put in place their patriarchs. They're keeping some of the monasteries from opening, or some of the seminaries and stuff from opening. So they're continuing to track in the wrong direction. We're watching them closely and encouraging. Part of our reason for doing this is when we point these things out is to encourage the administration to bring these topics up during the course of various negotiations, which, in this case of Andrew Brunson, the administration was extremely involved, and the president himself personally involved in that case, which was successful, was a key part of the success of bringing him home.
Well, and so this is actually a question, that's a level of attention that it's very hard to bring to every one of the adopted, people and so forth. Is it, without that level of attention, is it still possible to make a difference? This is something I want to ask you about a little further, because of course there's this case of Sudan, which we'll talk about in a bit, but.
That's a really good question. Because people say, well, obviously the president can't get involved in every case that exists out there, and that's true, he can't. And the administration can't get involved in every case out there. I mean, the case of Leah Sharibu in Nigeria, she's a Nigerian girl. She's not an American, she's Nigerian. In Andrew's case, he was an American, giving more emphasis to the president. But this administration is very committed. In fact, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a personal friend, has said on numerous occasions that the number one foreign policy for the United States is religious freedom. And they are committed to that in all of the policies that they pursue. So, but here's what it does do. When the president takes a personal interest in one of these cases or gets involved in one of these cases, it communicates a message to foreign leaders and to non-government leaders, terrorists and whomever, that religious freedom is a top priority for this administration. And so I've met with various leaders around the world, some in Islamic countries that have not so good records on religious freedom issues, that have taken note of the priority placed on religious freedom by this administration and are wanting to adjust their policies. Some are more aggressive than others in changing their policies to kind of, America is a world leader. We're an influencer. And so when we put a top priority, a top emphasis on this issue, it has an impact on other countries and their behavior.
Well, so let's talk about one of the countries that it's arguably difficult to influence, which is China, which is of course one of my personal interests and so forth. I wanted to kind of dive a bit deeper into here before we go into the Sudan question. It's actually I looked at the report. I kind of dove into each report. Each country has 2 pages. It's actually a good read. I'm going to recommend that people take a look if you're interested in any country, because it's actually quite digestible, I think, for almost anyone.
We did that. We did that intentionally, and yeah. That's new for this year. Is that we wanted to make it more user friendly, and people, if you can see 2 pages, you're more likely to read it. We focus on the big picture and the recommendations that we make. And so I'm glad to hear that you like that new format, because it is new. We've actually had about a 50% reduction in terms of the pages, so that we can just make it more user friendly.
No, absolutely. And so, of course, sort of headlining this, you have the, up to 1.8 Uyghur Muslims in the concentration camps in Xinjiang, which has been, kind of a big story, relatively speaking, when it comes to the China human rights stories out there. I think many people will be familiar with that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to that, but also to some of the other findings around China and which groups, you noted and so forth.
Well, your initial statement is very accurate in that it is difficult to influence China on this. Although I do know that even in the trade negotiations that these issues came up, and of course we were pushing for that to occur. But you point out the Uyghur Muslims, you're right. There's been a lot of a focus this past year on the Uyghurs, and that in part because the State Department put an emphasis on it. Ambassador Sam Brownback made a focus of the Uyghur Muslims who are in these concentration camps. A little more recently, it's been shown that they've been used for forced labor in factories around the country, some with connections to U.S. businesses. But maybe, and then there's been some more recent stories which we've not necessarily delved into because we're still gathering information. But before I leave the Uyghurs, one point that I think maybe has not been driven home enough on the Uyghurs is the use of artificial intelligence to track their movements, not just those that are in the concentration camps, but to track the entire Uyghur population using cameras and facial recognition software, which has been developed in China and is now being exported to other countries where you have repressive governments. So that's something to keep an eye on. That's very troubling when you see the use of this technology combined with the social scores that some may be familiar with, where if you check out the wrong books, or you go to a church too often, because they're tracking you, they know where you are, and they know the behavior engaged in, and so you might not be able to buy a train ticket or an airline ticket or get a pass to go somewhere, or your retirement might be affected. So this is something to keep an eye on, because it's not going to stay contained just with the Uyghur population. I mean, every move they make is tracked, and they even have, and I'm not going to get the name of this program just right. I think it's called Family Program, where in Xinjiang, where they have, oftentimes the man may be in a prison camp, a concentration camp, an education camp, they might call it. They will bring in someone to live in the home with the family. Another man will come in and live in that home on a rotating basis, just to try to make sure that they're being properly integrated. This is both religious and ethnic. They're trying to basically, it's you have to use, words have meaning, so you got to be careful how you use the words. But this is an attempt to simply eradicate the Uyghur ethnic group, which is as an ethnic group. It's predominantly Muslim, but it's a Turkic ethnic group that they're trying to eliminate by either assimilating them in, and that's what these training camps are, is to make them forget who they were, what they believed, and because they see that as a threat to the communist state. And we see Falun Gong, which is another religious minority that is suppressed in China, in fact linked to forced organ harvesting. There's been some reports out. Again, we haven't independently gone into those reports to verify them, but they're what I have seen very reliable, that's become big business in China, and it's primarily through these political religious prisoners that this is taking place. And of course, there's the Christian churches that are being torn down and forced even further underground. The arrest of pastors, and so it's just they're really they go after all religious groups, so they don't discriminate in that sense. They treat them all the same.
You know, Tony, and one group that we don't hear a lot about, which was, is also, deeply effective, is actually the Tibetans. We had Maura Moynihan on recently discussing it, and she explained that this is, it's kind of a devastation in that realm as well.
Yes, that is true. The Tibetans, and they're also, by the way, they use the facial recognition cameras to track them. So they're really falling under the same. They're not quite as it's not quite as well known as the Uyghur Muslims, but they're falling under the same repressive fingerprint that the Uyghur Muslims have been. Although, quite frankly, they've been at it. The Chinese have been at it a lot longer in putting the pressure on the Tibetans.
And this another thing I want to talk to you about. I'm just going to put a point out there. This is something that I think should worry everybody, and I think you touched on this, because this technology that's been developed, it's being exported, right?
Yes.
Like you said, this
Yes.
is, so you think this is far away. This is in a remote corner of China, in Xinjiang, and it's kind of, would you say, worse than what Orwell envisioned? I don't know. That's kind of what I think.
Yes, and that's extremely important to understand, because some of this technology has been facilitated by American companies. Now it's being exported from China now that it's been perfected, and who knows where it's going to end up, who's going to be using it. And this is, in the bigger picture here, it's important to understand, here in the United States, we have a First Amendment freedom. Now, there's been actually a pretty vigorous discussion about that in the last, month, as people have been, you had these governors put down stay-at-home orders and shut down churches and different things. Our First Amendment is very important. Most these countries that we're talking about don't have a First Amendment. They don't have those guaranteed freedoms, and it's one of the things that is very defining of America. Now, having said that, I just want to say that when we're talking about from a USCIRF perspective in religious freedom, it's an international definition of religious freedom we're talking about, going back to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, obviously, we were very critical in crafting that back in 1948. But as Americans, we need to pay attention what is happening around the world, because it's a reminder of the rights we have, and why it's, quite frankly, why we're privileged from a standpoint of, we're blessed, I should say, to have a First Amendment freedom, and why we must protect it and be, very vigilant in guarding that, or else we could see something like what's happening in China. That could happen elsewhere. It could happen here if we did not defend and protect that fundamental freedom.
While we're talking about China, I came across this letter, which was actually from the group that did this really deep dive into the forced organ harvesting, the China Tribunal, headed by the former prosecutor of Slobodan Milosevic, to no less, and a very, they basically, they compare that organ harvesting, by the way, to the worst atrocities committed in conflicts in the 20th century, even as far as the Holocaust, mass killings of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, Rwandan genocide, and so forth. Now, they wrote a letter to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, basically saying, we're very concerned that China is going to be on the UN Human Rights Council and going to be, making decisions. I know from a statement from USCIRF that you're also very concerned. Can you tell me about this, please?
Yes. Well, I mean, when you look at the track record, which is indisputable. Now, we can, maybe we don't have all the evidence for every allegation that's been made, but the evidence is overwhelming that China abuses human rights on a systematic basis, and religious freedom is chief among the targets. And so for them to be on, recognizing the United Nations being a part of the Human Rights Council would be laughable if it were not so troubling and frightening. That the old saying, the fox guarding the hen house. I mean, that pales as an illustration of what is taking place here. So yes, we have spoken out against that, and quite frankly, any country that cares about human rights should be speaking out about that and doing everything they can to prevent it from occurring.
Do you think the U.S. has a role with the UN or the UN Human Rights Council? This is a point of contention right now, obviously.
Right. Well, I think we should use every platform, every legitimate platform available to advocate for human rights and religious freedom. I'm not going to second guess the administration that's factoring in other elements in terms of their decision that they make on that. I will say that sometimes I have to question there's some good that the United Nations does do on occasion, but I have to question some of the things that they do and whether or not it is worth the time, energy, and resources that we put into it.
You were talking about the reality around the First Amendment with respect to coronavirus here in America. And of course, USCIRF, focuses internationally. And we've certainly observed a number of examples of basically this coronavirus situation being kind of used as cover for, different kinds of human rights abuses or different kind of, let's say, nefarious activity. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that from the perspective of religious freedom.
Yeah, we are. This is something that, you don't need much for those who are hostile toward religious freedom to use an opportunity to crack down on that freedom. And so we have seen what appears to be, in fact, we've released several statements warning that we're watching on these issues of how this crisis, this healthcare crisis, is being used. And I mean, and I understand, and I say USCIRF understands that this is you got to thread the needle on this, because we're even though we don't deal with the United States, we only deal with international issues. Honestly, we've seen that that's a difficult needle to thread here, even in the United States. And so, we're not nitpicking on this. We're looking for the big issues and where you see egregious behavior. I mean, we obviously understand that, this is not the time to be gathering, because that facilitates the spread of the virus. But, when you have places that, like here in the United States, it wasn't the message that was targeted, it was the meetings. So, I mean, that's not necessarily an issue. But when you have the message, there's been a couple of places where it was more they use this as an opportunity to go after the message and not just the meetings.
Let's jump to Sudan now, because this is actually, I was reading a little bit out of the report. This is kind of a success story. Amidst a lot of, I guess, the opposite that's certainly documented in this report. I'd like to do a little bit of a deeper dive, and I know this is an area that you're particularly focused on as well. So what have we seen happen there?
Well, what we saw is the people of Sudan rise up against a repressive regime. And it was primarily disproportionately the women of Sudan who rose up against al-Bashir's regime and, galvanized the public against him to where he was removed, and now we have this transitional government that was put in place. And this was, In some ways, we almost saw like a second, if you use the term Arab Spring, where we saw another wave of this destabilization in parts of the Middle East, Lebanon being one of them, Sudan. You see some, even in Iran, where you see the public kind of stirring again. So this was not something that was fostered from the outside or from the top down, but rather from the bottom up. And actually, it was something. A parallel would kind of be what we saw in northeast Syria until Turkey invaded that region, where we saw this really conglomeration of people of different ethnic, religious backgrounds coming together to form a government that respected religious freedom. It was very, very encouraging for that region of the world. In Sudan, it is, and is still would be an Islamic government, but with a desire to go back to the way they were prior to al-Bashir, which kind of weaponized Islam to make it a repressive regime. And so there's a desire to go back. And it's both from the young and from the old. The young people really want the economic opportunities that come with freedom, and it's quite fascinating to watch. The United States can facilitate it in a couple of different ways. They're changing all of their curriculum in their books, their elementary through high school, to have more of a study of religion, because they want to teach religion, but it's more of a study of religions, as opposed to a theology of Islam, which is very encouraging, and they're moving very quickly to get that done. They're also working to abolish the blasphemy and apostasy laws, which would be a huge step forward, giving more religious freedom, allowing people to, according to the 1948 Declaration of Universal Human Rights, the ability to change their religion. So some very, very encouraging things. Now, we took them off of the CPC list for the first time since we've been doing this report, but put them onto the special watch list because this is a journey. We're not there yet, but we see very, very encouraging signs. And the Prime Minister is a really nice man who has dedicated himself to seeing Sudan move forward.
No, fascinating. So, and blasphemy is, saying the wrong thing against a sacred figure, presumably, or teaching. Apostasy, for the benefit of our viewers,
is to change your religion. The blasphemy could be as simple as asking a question. In the Protestant religion, at least in Baptist, you call that a business meeting. But that was a joke. The issue is the questioning, the Islamic faith. That could be blasphemy in many cases. Now, it can be more extreme, but it can be as simple as that. Apostasy would be if you were Muslim and then you changed your faith. That would be apostasy. You can't do that. So that changing those laws, which are, I think, about 62 different countries have those, that would be quite a significant step forward toward religious freedom. Very significant.
Absolutely. I mean, unquestionably. Thank you for that. So another thing that came out of this report, which frankly I wasn't expecting, and this is an issue very close to me. My father-in-law survived the Buchenwald concentration camp. He's one of the few survivors around these days because of the years. I'm going to read what was written in the report. 4 in 10 young European Jews considered emigrating due to anti-Semitism in the past year. What? When I read this, I simply couldn't fathom. Is this real? Where's this happening? This is shocking.
Yeah, it is shocking, and we had a hearing on Capitol Hill regarding this, and the rapporteur for the UN Special Rapporteur on anti-Semitism, who presented, said, look, we need to be paying. I asked him, so why is this important? Because I know why it's important, but I asked him, why is it important? And he said, it is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to religious freedom. If we turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to anti-Semitism, that's just the beginning. And we will end up someplace we don't want to go. And it's not going to confine itself just to the Jewish faith. It ultimately will feed its hatred upon all faiths. And so this is a growing problem. It's a growing problem domestically. Again, something that we don't get into, but it is a growing problem internationally in Europe. We've seen attacks on Jewish synagogues, and it's something that we must address. Elan Carr, who is a special envoy for anti-Semitism for the United States, has testified before our committee, and they're being very aggressive in dealing with this and encouraging other countries to do the same.
You know, this is almost half of the young Jewish people, according to the study. I haven't looked at how the study was conducted, but that's really a huge number. So, you know, and there's something more. So there's some attacks on synagogues, but there's some kind of climate where they're of discrimination. Like what's happening there, and where's this happening?
Well, it is happening in places like France. We're seeing it in other parts of Europe. The UK, the Labour Party has been taking positions that would appear to be anti-Semitic. It is when you begin to look at it, and especially if you don't know history, and it's important that you personalize this because of your father-in-law, so you know history. Unfortunately, and this is a part of the solution, by the way, is that we teach history as it pertains to what happened to the Jewish people in World War II, what the Germans, the Adolf Hitler and others did to the Jewish population, that the Holocaust was real, and we teach that for the reason of not repeating it. And when you if you go through Ad Vashem, or you go through the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you see how history does repeat itself. I mean, you look at the BDS movement and other things, that's very similar to what happened in the late 1930s in Germany. So that's a part of the call, both from the UN and from the special envoy from the United States, is to make sure that we're teaching our young people what this is and that what happened, so that we don't repeat it.
You know, this is interesting, because this is sort of the more, I guess, philosophical discussion I wanted to have with you, which we've already touched on to some extent, which is basically, why does this matter to me? You know, over in Sudan, over in Xinjiang, over in, frankly, you know, democratic European countries, from the sounds of it, there's really troubling things happening. Why should I care?
That's a really good question, because we have to answer that question so that people will pay attention to this issue. And you know, we're coming at this not from a standpoint, again, let me just say that the United States has the gold standard, or we know we have all the answers. This is a universal declaration of religious freedom. Now, I would say that America is a country that people want to come to in part for the freedoms that we have, including religious freedom. And so we have to be cognizant that freedom could be lost. And we have an obligation, I believe, because we have freedom, to advocate for those who don't have it. I mean, I think that's what, you know, and if I can borrow from a kind of a Western Christian mindset, which is predominantly what America has historically operated from, is that in the Christian faith, everyone has a choice. You can't force someone to make a choice. God himself, you read back to the beginning of in Genesis, where he gave man a choice whether to follow him or not. We can't make people make a choice, but we certainly can advocate for them to have a choice. And that's where religious freedom comes in, that we advocate for every man, woman, and child to have an ability to choose whether or not they want to follow God and how they will do so. And so that's been kind of a guide stone for the United States all these years. And again, I go back to something I said earlier, that we sometimes, I think, take for granted this freedom that we have in this country. And I think it's helpful by focusing on the plight of others and helping them, that it reminds us that our freedoms here need to be protected as well.
So, Tony, the report has a number of recommendations in there. I'm wondering if you could highlight a few of the things that you think are key for our viewers to know.
Well, they're kind of specific to country in most cases. For instance, some countries like Afghanistan, which is on our special watch list, we're concerned there because of the capacity of the Afghan government to provide protection for religious minorities. One of the things we encourage in that country, and a couple of others actually as well, Egypt being one of them, I believe, is to help those governments better protect the religious minorities, the houses of worship, regardless of what they might be, to able to put both physical security and other means there so that people can go to their houses of worship, regardless of what faith they are, in safety and security. We also advocate for the use of the Global Magnitsky Act, which was passed in 2017, which allows the U.S. government to put sanctions on individuals who are violators of religious freedom. And frankly, the administration has used that quite well in this past year. I think about 8 individuals were targeted with the Magnitsky Act provisions in this in 2019. There's also recommendations, as I mentioned, in Sudan to help with the publishing of their new textbooks. There's Saudi Arabia. Speaking of textbooks, we continue to push to encourage the revision of their textbooks, which they've supposed to have been doing for quite some time, and they're a little slower. Maybe they can take their leads from Sudan. They seem to be jumping right on it. So just, it varies from country to country. But I would say the overarching recommendation that we make in almost every case is that in discussions, I go back to Afghanistan, for instance, says our country has been in negotiations with the Taliban and reached an agreement with them that in all dealings with these foreign countries, that religious freedom is a part of the conversation.
And is there anything in particular that you could draw out as a win for USCIRF itself over the past year, let's say, or something that lasted longer?
Yes, actually. Since the inception, this was our 21st year, we've been advocating for someone for a position, and it was created actually under the International Religious Freedom Act, a position in the White House working with a national security advisor that focuses strictly on the issue of religious freedom. That has been vacant up until about 2 months ago. And that position for the first time has been filled. Again, another indication of the priority that this administration places on religious freedom. Another, you might recall last fall, the president at the United Nations, first time ever, a speech on religious freedom, the president designated $25 million to the protection of houses of worship and religious sites. That was something that we had been advocating for and encouraging to take place at the State Department. Would begin to train and provide equipment and resources for the protection of these sites because of all of these attacks on houses of worship. So that is on its way to being set up. So another win. And then, of course, we had a part to play in helping, we're not there yet, but on this journey with Sudan, we've had a part to play in that. So some positive developments along the way.
That's really, really encouraging to hear. Any final words before we finish up?
No, I just thank you for focusing on this issue, because I do think that, especially given what we're all focused on right now with the coronavirus, that we sometimes lose track of some of the other issues. This is a big issue that people everywhere in every place at all times have an opportunity to freely express themselves or not express themselves in their religious beliefs or convictions. And we've been given a lot in this country in terms of freedoms, and we should use our freedoms not only to protect our own, but to advocate for the rights of others to enjoy and experience those freedoms as well.
Tony Perkins, such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.